Sallust recounts.
Not far from the river Molucca, there stood in the middle of a plain a rocky hill, broad enough to support a fortress of moderate size, very high, and accessible only by a single narrow path. For the entire site was naturally steep, as though shaped by art and design.
Stefan Zell declined to identify this fortress precisely, noting that several North African sites could, in principle, fit such a description. Jerome Carcopino, by contrast, proposed Torirt as the Numidian stronghold. This identification, however, is unconvincing. Beyond the evident discrepancies between Torirt and Sallust's description, it encounters the same methodological difficulties as the attempt to equate the Molucca with the Muluya. In 1950, André Berthier and his team sought to resolve this long-standing problem by identifying both the Molucca River and Sallust's castellum. They proposed that the Molucca corresponds to the Melig River and that the fortress should be identified with the so-called Jugurtha tableland near present-day Castellum in El Kef. Although this hypothesis has been vigorously contested, it offers a coherent reconstruction that accords closely with Sallust's topographical and logistical indications. The flat-topped mountain at Castellum corresponds with striking precision to Sallust's Mons Saxius. The plateau is accessible by a single narrow approach, a staircase, exactly as Sallust notes, when he emphasizes that the site was accessible only by one narrow path. Archaeological features at the summit further strengthen this identification. Numerous grain silos are cut directly into the rock, deep and sealed with stone slabs covered by earth, making them both waterproof and discreet. In addition, 19 carefully constructed water reservoirs have been documented, their measurements corresponding to Carthaginian cubits. These installations closely match Sallust's description of a fortress.
Fortress well supplied with arms and men, with an abundance of grain and a spring of water.
No other known natural stronghold in Algeria or Morocco conforms so closely to this combination of topographical and logistical criteria, whereas the Jugurtha tableland does so in every essential respect. Finally, the Melig River flows not far from this site and was formerly known locally as Melkak, a name plausibly derived from the Berber or Punic root MLK, Melek, meaning king or owner. This linguistic survival lends additional support to Berthier's identification of the Melig with Sallust's Molucca. An intriguing account from 1896, preceding Zell's work by 3 decades and Berthier's thesis by nearly half a century, records a French captain's expedition to Castellum. He reported that local inhabitants identified the flat-topped mountain as Jugurtha's tableland and preserved a tradition according to which King Jugurtha had concealed his treasures there, treasures the Romans were said to have sought in vain. This raises a striking question. How could local communities have retained such a detailed narrative, so closely aligned with Sallust's description, more than 2 millennia after the events? No comparable tradition is attested in any of the other locations proposed by historians for Sallust's castellum. The persistence and specificity of this local memory strongly support identifying Sallust's castellum with Jugurtha's tableland at Castellum and the Molucca River with the Melig. This identification, however, leads to a further and crucial question. If the castellum was indeed Jugurtha's tableland, then which site should be identified as Cirta Regia, the capital toward which Marius advanced after the capture of the castellum? Constantine, one of Algeria's principal cities, takes its name from Colonia Constantiniana, founded under Emperor Constantine the Great. Before that, under Augustus, it was known as Colonia Julia Juvenalis Honoris et Virtutis. Going further back still, during the Regnum Numidae, the city has long been identified as Cirta Regia, the royal capital of the Numidian kingdom, an identification proposed by Stephan Zell. Yet this identification rests more on conjecture than on firm evidence, even though it was later adopted as fact by many scholars. But what if Cirta lay elsewhere? More than 200 kilometers to the east lies El Kef, in present-day Tunisia, an ancient and strategically important city whose history stretches back to the Carthaginian era. In antiquity, El Kef was known as Sicca Veneria, later as Colonia Julia Veneria Cirta Nova Sicca, a name that strikingly includes both Sicca and Cirta. When Arabic became widespread, the city came to be known as Shakbanaria, preserving echoes of its ancient name. Contrary to what is commonly assumed, the epithet Nova almost certainly refers to Sicca rather than to Cirta, since Nova typically precedes the name it qualifies. Even Zell himself admitted, "We do not know why the same name was given to Sicca." Latin inscriptions from El Kef deepen the mystery. Some inhabitants are identified as Cirtenses, others as Siccenses. A dedication to Devo Augusto Conditori makes it clear that the Siccenses were Roman settlers, implying that the Cirtenses were the original population. This strongly suggests that Cirta existed before Sicca Veneria, and that both names once coexisted within what is now El Kef. On the other hand, in Constantine, archaeologists have demonstrated the city's rich Carthaginian heritage through the large number of Punic inscriptions and coins discovered there. More intriguingly, the city did not originally bear the name Cirta, but Sarim Batim, a name attested by several inscriptions. Another key piece of evidence comes from the famous Makthar harvester inscription, discovered in the 19th century and dating to the mid-3rd century. It recounts,
"When the sickle-bearing gangs of men had made their way to the fields, whether heading for the nomads of Cirta or the fields of Jupiter, as harvester I preceded them all, first into the fields."
Since Mount Jupiter is securely identified with Zagwan, the Cirta mentioned here must have been nearby, not Constantine, over 300 kilometers away. Such a journey for seasonal harvesting would be implausible, just as it would be to imagine Marius marching from Capsa to the Muluia River, a distance of more than 1,500 kilometers. Would not El Kef be a far more reasonable destination? There is another striking problem. If Constantine truly were Cirta Regia, why do ancient authors fail to mention its most dramatic feature, its deep ravine and eagle's nest setting? These characteristics were clearly described much later by Arab writers and travelers such as al-Bakri, al-Idrisi, and Leo Africanus, and even by Louis Bertrand in the early 20th century. How could Sallust, governor of Africa Nova, which encompassed much of the Numidian kingdom, as well as Pomponius Mela and Pliny the Elder, have overlooked something so conspicuous? Now consider the alternative: El Kef as the capital of the Numidian kingdom. This identification aligns closely with Sallust's Bellum Jugurthinum. The Molucca River, identified by Berthier as the Meleg, and the Castellum, identified with Jugurtha's tableland at Calayat Snen, lie close to El Kef. In this context, Sallust's account that Marius and his troops marched for 4 days to reach Cirta becomes entirely plausible. Something far less credible if they had marched from near the Oued Moluya to Constantine. Likewise, the Muthul River, another geographical marker in Sallust, was identified by Charles Sommagnes with Oued Tessa, also near El Kef. The episode of the Ligurian, who revealed a secret path to the Castellum, a decisive moment in the war, was likewise located by Berthier and later scholars at Jugurtha's tableland. Even Polybius's account of the death of Massinissa in Cirta fits better. Scipio arrived there in only 2 days from his position, possibly at Utica, an impossible journey to Constantine with ancient means of transport. Taken together, these geographical, epigraphic, and textual clues form a coherent picture. They strongly support the conclusion that Cirta Regia was El Kef, offering a far more consistent reading of Sallust and calling for a reassessment of the true extent and borders of the Numidian kingdom. An attempt to reconstruct the Mappa Regnum Numidiae was first proposed by Berthier in 1950 and later reinforced by Dr. Mohammed Talili's insightful thesis in 2008. This revised map shows that the Numidian kingdom was far smaller than traditionally believed. Its western border lay at the Oued Meleg, not at the Moluya River. As we have seen in Sallust, this river marked the boundary between the Numidian and Moorish kingdoms. The same idea appears in Apuleius, writing in the 2nd century, who described his hometown of Madoros as being Numidiae et Getuliae in ipso confinio, at the very border between Numidia and Mauritania. Today, this interpretation is further confirmed by several Latin inscriptions and boundary stones discovered along the Meleg River. In this light, Sallust's geographical descriptions suddenly become fully coherent. The kingdom of Bacchus would have been located in the Ores Nementia region of present-day Algeria, while the kingdom of Jugurtha extended westward into the upper basin of the Oued Meleg, the ancient Molucca. Every Numidian town mentioned by Sallust, every event he describes, including the Castellum and the Muthul River, now falls neatly within these newly identified borders of the Regnum Numidiae. With this reinterpretation, the Bellum Jugurthinum no longer appears confusing or contradictory. On the contrary, the geography finally makes sense, and the narrative unfolds with clarity. Yet this clarity raises an unavoidable question. Why, then, is El Kef still not widely accepted as Cirta Regia, the Numidian capital? The answer lies largely in the authority of Stephan Zell. It was Zell who first identified Cirta with Constantine and extended Numidia's borders to the Moluya River. His conclusions were subsequently adopted and reinforced by many historians until this interpretation became deeply entrenched, difficult to challenge, even when new evidence suggested otherwise. Another challenge lies in a persistent confusion between two very different entities. The Numidian kingdom, established around 201 to 202 BC, and the Roman province of Numidia. Yet it was precisely during this long transitional period that El Kef changed its name from Cirta Regia to Colonia Julia Veneria Cirta Nova Sica, while Constantine evolved from Sarim Batim into Colonia Juvenalis Cirta. As a result, the older Cirta-El Kef, now known as Nova Sica, gradually faded from prominence. At the same time, the newer Cirta, Constantine, expanded under Roman influence and came to dominate the historical landscape. Over the centuries, the distinction between the two Cirtae blurred, and the memory of one quietly merged with the rise of the other. It was through this process that modern historiography came to fuse the ancient Cirta Regia of El Kef with the later Cirta of Constantine, producing a single but ultimately misleading historical narrative. This leaves us with a fundamental question. Should this narrative continue to be accepted without scrutiny, or is it time to revisit the evidence and revise our understanding? If these assumptions can be re-examined, how many others might also call for reconsideration? And if not now, when and by whom will the historical record finally be set straight?